Hello and welcome to the Storeroom of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson, and today we're going to be doing another topical study related to the book of Revelation with a guest interview. I'm pleased to welcome Cindy Beaver to the Storeroom of Scripture. Cindy and I became acquaintances through the Advanced Apologetics Facebook group as moderators, along with my previous guest, Carrie Griffel. Cindy and I have another thing in common, which is that we both work vocationally in the world of computer science, even as we're both passionate about our avocation in biblical studies. Cindy completed a 2-year Bible study program called Crossways with Dr. Harry Wint and is a certified graduate of the Awakening School of Theology, founded by Dr. Michael Heiser. She's been a regular guest on the Genesis Marks the Spot podcast, hosted by our mutual friend Carrie, adding great insight from her reading of the many primary sources and scholarly treatments of ancient Near Eastern material. So, Cindy, welcome to the Storm of Scripture.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm so happy to be here today.
I've listened to you and Carrie talk over various aspects of biblical theology over at the Genesis Marks the Spot podcast. And a few times you mentioned trade guilds and how they're interconnected with really all of daily life in the ancient world, including religious aspects of life. And so after hearing that observation, I reconsidered the text of Revelation with an eye to trades and economic issues. And I was surprised, actually, at how often they crop up in John's visions. But before we get into some specific passages from Revelation, I'd like to give you the floor to talk a few minutes about economics in the ancient world, about trades, and how they are important. Do you give us a little bit of a brief overview of trades in the ancient world?
Sure, I will do what I can. So what I understand about it is really they were far more sophisticated than most people give them credit for. The ancients had weights and measures that even in Hammurabi's code, and Hammurabi's code was like 2500 BC. And, so that they were trying to be very consistent. Think about, you go to your gas pump, and I don't know, but I see a little certificate from the state that says this one has been certified, and we know that we even rely on our cereal boxes to have 14 ounces or 16 ounces or however many. When purchasing, you want to be traded fairly. And so it is interesting to see, even as far back as 5,000 years ago, there were some regulations that were put in place in order to ensure that people were treated fairly. They also, you can see within the Amarna letters that were found in Egypt of international commerce going on. You see one of the Pharaoh receiving letters from different kings and emperors from other kingdoms, and where they would send gifts. But these gifts were more things of samples of these are the products that we have, and they wanted to establish a trade relationship. We know, for example, Sidon and Tyre, they had the lumber, and they would float all of the trees down the Mediterranean. Can you imagine these barges that had some ropes and things like that, where they would have a flotilla of lumber? But it was the cedars of Lebanon that were so highly prized. And we read about that in the Bible with Solomon. But there would be tin and different types of metals that would be important. Gold from the Egyptian area was very important. We see there's a king that's in Babylon that receives a pair of beautiful encrusted sandals that came from Crete. So there's definitely valued things, the spices, the silk trade, all of those things, they were in place. Now, there wasn't money exchanged. It was much more of a bartering system. But, I will give you this amount of this spice in exchange for your purple cloth, all of the valuable commodities. And so it's really interesting just to think about the fact that there was a sophisticated level of trade. That's even how Solomon got so rich. He was kind of the middleman broker between what was going on in the African continent and what was going up in Asia. He was the middleman, and so he got a slice of the pie by brokering the deals and things like that. So
Well, as I
very.
understand it, I mean, that's one reason why that territory is valued even today quite
Exactly.
aside from the religious quarrels that come up between the Arabs and the Christians and the Jews and everyone else who wants to fight over a slice of that pie religiously. But it is just a nexus of trade. If you
It
don't
is.
go through there, then you have to go through more difficult routes over water or over mountains or through desert. The Levant and the area around Jerusalem, I know there's one ancient map that has Jerusalem at the center of three like leaf shaped items. One is Europe, one is Asia, and one is Africa. And at the
Yes.
center of all three of those leaves is Jerusalem. That is a very, I think, telling to how central that area was in all ways, including trade.
Well, and it's why God chose that spot. I really believe that
Mm,
he knew what he was doing. He also chose the time of the Roman period when there was the Pax Romana. Now was it wasn't necessarily truly peaceful because it was enforced by military might, but still they had roads. They had they had ability to communicate quickly where they could have something like the Pony Express going on. So there was definitely an era of time where travel was made easier considering the methods that they had available to them. And again, even the merchant ships and things like that, or travel, the apostles and things like that on the ships, there were no passenger ships. What you would do is you would go down to the port and you would book a slot on a merchant's ship, and you were usually just kind of staying on the deck. You might have erected some kind of a tent or some shelter to protect yourself,
mm.
but you were just, extra merchandise that was going. And you see how Paul, they're like, we're going to throw everything off. And so that,
Well, and I think about Jonah, who
yes,
booked passage on a ship, and
yes,
he did get thrown off.
yeah. But so, and that's one thing that we do need to also be mindful of is that being a merchant, especially having to do with the ship building and sailing, that was a highly speculative business
Mm.
because of the predominance of shipwrecks happening. They would stay close to the coast. They didn't go out in the middle if they could avoid it. But so it was a significant investment to get the ship and get the crew and all of the items. And I'm sure they had networks and things like that of, okay, we've got some space on our ship. Do you want to? But they didn't really have like insurance the way we have insurance. And so there would have been financial backers that were basing their whole, you know, will we make a profit on this one, and doing investing and things like that. So there was a lot of that was going on. Again, think about it. This is how the culture would have had to work back then. There weren't investment bankers and stuff like that. The banks were the temples. If you were going to put your money anywhere, it was being invested in the temple, or it was invested in your trade guild, where you would and if we talk about what is a trade guild, I mean, we have things like that. We have the electrical workers, we have the unions for like the car manufacturing. Unions have are less predominant these days, but back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, very much so. There still are teachers' unions, there's nurses' unions, there's the union for the airline workers.
Well,
And
and the movie industry, they
yes,
just had a major
yes, you're
strike for
right.
weeks on end,
You
and
know,
so
and so they did, but the trade guilds were even more powerful. And a trade guild had to be approved by the Roman Senate. So it wasn't like anybody could do it, but you see evidences in the Bible of the stoneworker guilds. Paul was probably a member of a tent worker, leather worker guild. And so I don't know if you've watched The Lord of Rings, The Rings of Power, but in one of the episodes when Galadriel and the man that they were calling Halbert, were in Numenor, he wanted to go and work at a forge, but they all had a little badge, and only the people that had the badge that were part of the trade guild, only they could use the forge. And you do see evidence, and I have a couple of books that Jeff can recommend to you, put out there, of they're fictional books, but it does kind of talk about what it's like. The trade guilds would, in the city setting, they'd kind of replace the whole paterfamilias, family. They were your family, they were your community. Back in the Roman culture, individualism was definitely not predominant like it is for us. And they lived in community, and your identity was associated with your group, whether it was the group of your family, like in Abraham's time with Isaac and then Jacob and his family, where they were all together and they had a business. Well, as people started migrating and living in cities, and as the culture changed, the trade guilds kind of took over that role. And so the trade guilds would have the gods that they would worship. They had banquets and things where they would have the meat sacrificed. And it was pretty much obligatory that you will attend these things. And so here you have Christians that are like, I can't eat this meat. So they would try to like show up to the banquet late, in order to keep going. But until they might be caught out, and then they'd be like, no, they'd be forced to participate in the sacrifice, or else they'd lose their job, those types of things. But the reason for the sacrifices and all of that stuff, it wasn't necessarily, it was more to ward off evil. They didn't want the gods to turn against them. But these trade guilds would, if you belonged and were a member, they would take care of you. If you were having a personal shortage, they would make sure that their members were buried properly. It was very much of a community, and you interacted with this group of people. But they also controlled all of the inventory, and so even the supplies, like if you were a metal worker, you couldn't get raw ore unless you worked with the trade within the trade guild. You couldn't sell your things unless you were a member of the trade.
Well, I want to look back a little bit to a couple of things you said that connect, I think, fairly directly with some of the passages here in the book of Revelation. And the first one, where you mentioned that the gold was basically either in a temple or in a trade. And that makes me think of one of the very first references to trades that I caught in the book of Revelation, which is in Revelation chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. This is a part of the message to Laodicea. And Jesus says to that church, because you are saying, I am rich and have become rich, and I have need of nothing, and you do not know that you're wretched and pitiable and poor and blind and naked, I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire, in order that you may become rich, and white clothing, in order that you may be clothed, and the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and eye salve to smear on your eyes, in order that you may see. So
So
it's odd if you think
Laodicea
about it
had,
to buy gold from someone, but that's what God says we need to do.
yeah. So Laodicea had, was known for their banking institutions that they had, as well as the medical school that took ophthalmology. And so the salve was a commodity that the Laodiceans would put produce and sell. And they also had a world famous textile trade for the woolens and tunics that they sold. So here, really, this is very personal and talking about Laodicea and the biggest type of businesses that were going on. And what Christ is doing is he's really um, telling them that these people are anchoring themselves in worldly goods. Instead of relying on God, they're relying on the world. And so it's they are still willingly cooperating with the adulterous trade communities, and doing all these things that are opposite to what God's world and God's orientation is. And so that's where Jesus is flipping things on its head, going, don't rely on the gold of this world, rely on me and the wealth that I bring, which is a totally different wealth. It's not, it's the fullness of life. It's everything, being a fully human, and living in that way. These people have pretty much caved, and they're still just operating within the Roman culture. And this is a wake up call that you need to disavow that, move away from that. Really, it's a choice of walking towards God or walking towards the Roman Empire. Which one are you going to choose?
And you said a moment ago that these trade guilds became substitutes for family units. And that was where the gold was and the trades were and where loyalty was for a
Yes.
lot of people. And perhaps part of the undercurrent of this message to Laodicea is you need to invest in your church family, in your fellow Christians, the way you have invested in these trade guilds. They're not your family. The church is your family. Your fellow Christians, that's the
Absolutely.
substitute for the pater familia, is Jesus and your family at church.
Yes, exactly. And that even if you have a material loss in wealth, you are putting the riches in heaven where they are safe and they will be saved, and kept safe for you for eternity.
Exactly. And one other thing you said, and maybe we'll take this one out a little bit out of order because you talked about how if you weren't a member of the trade guild, you couldn't do business. You couldn't sell your goods. You couldn't get raw materials to make your goods. You had very few options if you had a skill but weren't part of the trade to do anything with it. And I had also heard that, sorry, I have to mute my phone call. I had also heard that at a larger scale, between countries, between like Rome and a client state that they might have an joining state agreement with, like for instance, Egypt. Egypt was not technically Rome, but it was a client state where they had Roman influence and there were Roman military in Egypt and so on. But trade between a state and Rome required an authorization. You had to be officially recognized as a friend of Rome to do trade with Rome. If you didn't have the paperwork that said you were an authorized friend of Rome, then you didn't buy or sell in any Roman territory, or to any Roman citizen, because you had to have that authorization, which puts me in mind of the mark of the beast.
Okay.
Skipping all the way to Revelation 13, this beast, the beast from the land, he actually, and actually, this is not, there are three beasts here. There's a beast from the sea, then there's a beast from the land, and then the beast from the land creates a idol or image that also seems to have some authority on its own. And it's this image that causes the people, just to quote from Revelation 13, 16, and 17, he causes all the people, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, and the free and the slave, that they give them a mark on their right hand and on their forehead, and that no one was able to buy or to sell except the one who had the mark, the name of the beast or the number of his name.
Yep.
Now, there's a lot of discussions about the nature of this mark. Was it, or will it be, an actual physical branding of some nature? Is it just a spiritual metaphor? But what's often overlooked in the whole process is that the consequence of the mark is an economic consequence. You can buy or sell or not, whether you have the mark.
Well, and even look at like during World War II, where the Nazis had to wear the star, or the Nazis made the Jews wear the Star of David. They had a mark, and they were restricted in what they could do. So there's something even more current that we can look at now. A lot of people get really worried about what this mark is. Is it a credit card? Is it a vaccination? Is it an embedded chip in my body? But we have to remember that um, there's a corresponding mark put on Christians.
All right.
At our baptism, we have the cross of Christ, we have oil and things like that. So, to me, I would be less concerned about the fact that this is a physical thing or a tattoo. But again, it's much more of a philosophical thing or even a intellectual thing. The mark was a word that was used for the emperor's seal on business contracts. The impress of the Roman rulers had on the coins. And those coins were
Right.
really more propaganda than anything. People didn't use coins. They used coins to pay taxes and to do certain things, but most of the time, transactions were done through a bartering system. But there's definitely, something more to it. The other thing is that um, the by marking it on the forehead as well as the hand, that means an ideological commitment. Mentally, you are assenting to participation with this. And then the marking on the hand would be the practical outworking of that orientation. So that's where the mark is that you have bought into this system and you are participating in the system. And so I think those are just some interesting points to have with that. But definitely there was, I guess, with the Laodiceans, you see that, yeah, they're materially wealthy. Yeah, they're doing well because they have bought into the system and they're participating that way. The Christians, on the flip hand, are losing their jobs and they're not able to find the work that they did. So they may have to do menial labor. They may, have subsistence farming that they're doing. The community itself is doing whatever they can to share their resources. And we have to keep in mind that there would have been a mixture of wealthy and poor, slaves and free in the Christian churches. And so they would pool their resources. You look at Paul, where he's on his mission and he's taking a collection to send to the Jerusalem church. So they did that for each other because they knew that they were the community that they had to support, just like the trade guilds would be that family that would help support the participants in that. This the Christian church, the ecclesia, was the community that they had to look to for that support and aid.
Right. And that's right. And Paul's collection was it's interesting because Paul's collection represents a koinonia across a long distance.
Yes.
Most of the trade guilds and most of the social structures in Rome, apart from Roman authority itself, were quite localized. You were in a group of your city or your small community, and that was pretty much the extent of the network, or the people in the local area. For Paul to take up a collection for people on a completely different continent was a exception in that day. Maybe not unheard of, but fairly rare that loyalties could extend beyond our immediate community to communities in another place. But that was the exceptional nature of the church, that it was bigger than just us in our local community,
Yep.
but was around the world.
And another thing I'd like to bring up is that Paul was very, very careful not to receive monies. And he talks about that, not for personal work
Right.
or
Mhm.
from his teaching. And the reason behind that had to do with the whole client patron relationship.
Right.
Because if he took money, that would then mean that he was the client to a sponsoring patron. And there was obligation then, that an expectation that that sponsor, that patron is going to, I want you to vote this way, I want you to do these things, I want you need to do me a favor. I mean, that was really the grease of Roman life and Roman relationships. There was a client patron relationship at all different levels, within the empire. I mean, the Caesar would have been the top patron. A freed slave, his former master would always be a patron to him. And so we have, it's interesting to see how Paul was very, very careful and very smart about not getting himself caught into that type of relationship, so that he could remain free to do the work that he wanted to do, and to belong to Christ.
I agree. I've been listening to a podcast, which I would recommend to any history buff out there, called The History of Rome. It's a simple name of the podcast. And it takes every episode, starting with the mythological founding of Rome, steps through its history step by step. I'm just now up to the point where it's talking about Julius Caesar and actually his death and the end of the first triumvirate. But one thing that has come through clear, especially as is transitioning from the republic to the empire, is that patronage was absolutely essential in their political system. And what we would call graft, they called politics. That was just normal.
Yep,
You gave loans to Julius Caesar or whoever because you wanted that influence and you wanted him on your side, and vice versa. You did loans or favors for other people because you wanted their support. And it was all mutual and mostly known. Exact. In fact, the only time it became a scandal is if you try to keep it a secret who was your patron or who you were supporting. If you tried to keep it a secret, that was a problem. But if you were openly accepting gifts and supporting somebody's cause, that was totally expected in that
yep.
world.
Well, and the other thing is the wealthy would do things called liturgia, which was public service, public works, and we see signs of it. Because it would be, so and so built this temple, or so and so had this road improved, and really that built up their prestige, because the people that benefited from the temple or from this road being much more improved, it built their honor. And this is again the whole honor and shame. And so these relationships of who is your patron, and did the client do things in a positive manner, it all reflected back. All it all had to do with who knows who's friends with whom, what kind of actions have you done that are publicly known. Did you sponsor games to the gladiator? Did you sponsor somebody that got elected to to be the mayor of your city or whatever? Those types of things. That it was very, I mean, our political world today is not all that different. It really, really isn't. It's all who you know and what kind of money and influence you have.
We have a little bit of that uh, to thank for knowing who was doing what, because they would make public plaques and
Yes.
engravings on the public works that they were doing to ascribe who did it and when and for whom. So yes, we learn a lot about the history of Rome through their publicizing their public good acts.
Well, and it's even validated the truth of the Bible. I mean, the Pontius Pilate, we found stones that have his name that in Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea Maritima. And then also was it Gaius that's in Corinth? There's some stuff
Yes.
there. Yeah, that
Gaius, as a proconsul in Achaia, there's a public notice of his appointment, which is what allows us to date Paul's time, because we know from other sources that every appointment was only for a year or so. And so when we know who was Caesar and we know when Gaius was appointed in the reign of Caesar, then we know that within that year, Paul was in Corinth because Gaius is who he appeared before in a legal proceeding. So yeah,
yes.
some of the dating of our New Testament and the assurance that it is historically accurate and contemporary to the events comes from those public works.
Yep.
Uh,
So go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, what would you like to say there?
Oh, I was just going to say, so do we want to talk a bit about some of the other passages within Revelation?
Yeah, let's touch for a little bit on Revelation 6, 5 through 6, which I skipped over to get to Revelation 13. But in chapter 6, it's the breaking of the six seals on the scroll. And in verses 5 and 6, we read about the third scroll, the third seal. It says, "When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and the one seated on it had a balance scale in his hand. And I heard something like the voice in the midst of the four living creatures say, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the olive oil and the wine.'" Again, there's lots of different ways to go with exactly what do the seals mean, what is this black horse, and so on. But the scale is unmistakably a mercantile tool for measurement, and we're obviously talking about exorbitant prices for common goods. The
Yeah.
barley and the grain, those were staples of living in that world, and the oil and the wine were luxury items. So what do you see here in connection to trades or economics?
Yeah, what to me it indicates is that there could potentially be a famine that's coming. And it's going to affect predominantly the grains, which is why they're going to be rationed. But it's not such a severe famine that the wine and the oil will be affected. Unfortunately, a denarius is a day's wage, and what it's forcing the people to do, at least for a day laborer, is they have to choose: are they going to eat today, or are they going to pay their rent, or do they need new shoes, or something like that? A quart of wheat would feed one person for one day.
Mhm.
3 quarts of barley would probably be able to feed a small family for a day. So there's what we're talking about is basically you all during this period, you'll be able to buy food, but nothing else.
Hmm.
And so that is an extreme hardship, especially, and it's going to hit the Christians first, the hardest because of the whole if they're not collaborating with the system, um, they're not going to have a lot of resource to be able to afford the other things that they may need, such as, clothing, food, shelter, wine, or oil. And, you need a little bit of oil in order to cook. So, one day, you may have to buy the oil and try to cobble, don't eat a full loaf in one day, but try to portion it over a couple days so that you can afford to buy the oil.
It's hard times one way or another. Economic hardship definitely embodied here with this black horse.
Yes.
And some maybe part of this is that some features of economics are outside of human control. Oh, you can raise the prices arbitrarily. I understand that in Rome proper, Roman citizens did not pay for food. They were supplied food from the government for free as Roman citizens. Now, I don't know whether this prices would mean that in times of difficulty, they're not going to get food for free because there's no food to be had for anyone, or what that might suggest. But governments can arbitrarily affect pricing for a while, but God is ultimately in control of the resources. The natural resources come under his control, especially for something like crops, which are so dependent on rain and good weather to grow properly. So whatever Rome or any empire thinks they control, the means of production, they really don't.
Right.
God's always at the head of that means of production, and he controls it.
And but we do know that Rome would import food from Egypt. I mean, Egypt wound up being the breadbasket for many places.
Yeah,
If there was a ship disaster, and a ship went down, that was a lot of grain that would have been lost.
that's true. And I have to pull up the map just a second. I think, is it Sardinia? What's that large island between Italy and North Africa?
I think it might be Sardinia.
Sicily.
Okay.
Well, Sardinia,
S, it starts with
yeah, well, Sardinia is another island out there in the Mediterranean, but it's Sicily. Controlling Sicily was so important because it is the bridge between Italy and North Africa. As you said, they didn't go in the middle of the ocean or the middle of the Mediterranean Sea if they could avoid it. They would stay close to land. And the only way, the closest place from Italy to North Africa is across Sicily. So that was definitely a key element in controlling the flow of food from Africa to Italy. And I
They
think
also had they also had to be careful because of the winds.
mm,
They needed the winds to be blowing in the proper direction. So they would often do a circular path so that they wouldn't they may be go to and I'm thinking much more between like Egypt and Greece and then down the Levant and stuff like that, but they would do it in a certain pattern so that it wasn't like I'm just going to go, between um, Phoenicia and Egypt back and forth. They always did a circuit, and so they would collect different. The ship's captains would trade, and so they would always want to have a full ship. So they sell some of the product and then get new product that port had, and so on and so forth. I think that the grain ships between Egypt and Sicily and Rome, they they were much more just, doing a narrow path. But I do know that for a lot of the other trade that they were bigger circles that they were doing. But it was difficult because they were dependent on what the prevailing winds were. Not that they couldn't use the oars, but the oars were a secondary means for moving the ships.
yeah, the whole commerce was a complicated activity and fraught with risk
Yes,
because the easiest way was probably by water. If you had access to ships to move around from place to place, it's easier to sail than to walk. But you're
it was the
also
riskiest.
risky. You couldn't sail too close to the shore, or you would risk grounding. But if you got too far out, you risked the waves and the storms. So it definitely was a difficult thing. Overland was more certain, but took longer and had its own dangers as well. So yes, trade in the ancient world was difficult, and anybody could do it well. Usually got rich,
Yes.
and people who were in good, well-positioned places, like Jerusalem. like Italy, actually, in some ways. They
Yeah,
were well positioned between people groups to for the flow of goods to come through there. They made money.
yeah.
In fact, I want to move to our last passage, which is the longest one, and I think really one of the more surprising passages in all the book of Revelation. For all the difficulty of figuring out these beasts and all the complications of these seven seals and seven trumpets, what strikes me as odd is an emphasis on merchant activity. In when Babylon the Great falls in chapter 18 of the book of Revelation, there is an extended passage about all the trades that are impacted by the fall of Babylon. So I'm going to read Revelation 18, verses 11 through 19, uh, for a taste of this. And it's not actually the entire mention of mercantile trade. There's a little bit before and some after, but this is kind of the heart of the message here about the merchants mourning the fall of Babylon. So, starting in verse 11. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple cloth and silk and scarlet cloth and all kinds of scented wood and all kinds of ivory goods and all kinds of goods of precious wood and bronze and iron and marble and cinnamon and amomum and incense and ointment and frankincense and wine and olive oil and fine wheat flour and wheat and domesticated animals and sheep and horses and carriages and slaves and human lives. And the fruit of your soul desires, I'm sorry, and the fruit your soul desires has departed from you, and all the luxury and the splendor has perished from you, and they will never find them any more. The merchants of these things, who became rich for them, will stand far off, weeping and mourning because of the fear of her torment, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, dressed in fine linen and purple cloth and scarlet cloth, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, because in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. And every shipmaster and every seafarer and sailors and all those who labor on the sea stood far off and began to cry out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, Who is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, in which all those who had ships on the sea became rich from her prosperity, because in 1 hour she has been laid waste.
The the items that you listed are all luxury goods, and they were all always headed to Rome itself. There's also a lot of echoes in that this list of goods is similar to what is listed in Ezekiel 27. So uh, uh, when he's talking about, he's condemning Tyre, and the just again, and we know that Tyre was another merchandising, I mean, that's what they did, and they're
Right.
Phoenician traders, and those ships were the ships that everybody wanted to have, because they were built so well to be able to do the long journeys. And so I really think what we're seeing here is it's a financial collapse. There's been a huge calamity. Think about the start of the Depression here, where the stock market totally collapsed.
Right.
Or even in what was it, 2008, 2010, the housing market, where the stock market took a severe dip. I mean, I was so afraid to look at my 401k there for a while because I lost a significant chunk of money because of that. So this is something that could affect us today, even as it affected or has the potential to affect ancient Rome. Our economic security, I think it's a myth. I mean, it's more by luck and by manipulation than it is actually sustaining itself. The Fed puts in brakes and they're watching how much inflation do they want and how much interest rates they want to charge because they're trying to play this little game, but they're also jerking us around and the wealthy become wealthier and the poor become poorer.
I can imagine the kind of feeling evoked in this passage was the kind of feeling that especially someone involved in trade and work had when COVID-19 shut down entire cities. When you could look at a street in Manhattan and it was vacant, a place that's normally thriving with activity and economic activity, specifically people selling on the streets, restaurants and businesses open, and the lights going, and then all of a sudden it's dark and empty. And
Or you go to the grocery store and the shelves are empty.
right,
You know,
yes.
we didn't have a lot of meat in the meat case. There was no toilet paper. I still don't quite understand what the toilet paper deal was, but um and or then we also had ships that were in the ocean and there weren't any drivers to pick up the stuff, so then we had terrible
Right.
backlog with inventory of all types.
What about that one ship that got stuck sideways in the small strait in Africa? I don't remember the details, but just seeing the picture of this giant ship in a little puddle of water sideways and not moving. And that
Yep.
one ship, not only was that ship giant and had a lot of goods on it that were not going anywhere, but it was blocking any other ships from being able to use the same important waterway to get out.
Yep.
So one misstep and it can have dire effects, let alone the fall of an entire government, which is what's being pictured here in Revelation. And I think Rome remains the primary imaginative symbol of this fall. In John's day, there was no other city that would represent world wealth and commerce better than Rome. So while I don't know that necessarily Revelation 18 is speaking about the fall of Rome, I think it's using all the imagery of what a fall of Rome would be, because that's what they imagined commerce was, and that was commerce in their world. And for Rome just to shut down and be destroyed. And I think the emphasis there twice in this passage, and it actually comes up outside of what I read, this idea that it fell in a day. It was the Rome was the eternal city by the time of I I'm dating this at about 100 AD, but even if it's 60 AD, Rome had been around for nearly a millennia in the days of its time as a republic, in the days of its time as an empire, which was actually a lot shorter by this time, but it had still been around for centuries. And John pictures it as falling in a day. Once God's judgment falls, it happens fast.
Yep. And yeah, I mean, look at things have to us happened. The COVID thing was just, it wasn't quite overnight, but it was
Oh,
months, boom,
right.
weeks that this happened. The same thing with the stock market crash in back in the 20s, late 20s. It was, and people there they jumped from roofs, they laid on train tracks, they were committing suicide all over the place because they were financially ruined. This imagery is as real to us today as it was to John's audience.
I in March of 2020, I left to go on a short-term 1 week mission trip to Haiti. And I was there for 3 days with the senior minister of our church. Went together to Haiti. And after we were there for 3 days, the church members, elder and staff called Rick and said, you need to get back here because things are happening and we're not sure. The governor has asked us not ask groups not to collect, not to gather, no gatherings greater than a certain number of people. The church getting together would definitely match this. So what are we going to do? How are we going to react to this situation? And we need you back. So when we left for Haiti, things were dicey. My wife actually didn't want me to go to Haiti because she was worried about travel overseas. And this was just off the coast of Florida, so it's not that far. It's not like going
Mhm.
to Europe, but it was still not in America. And so she was concerned about us going and all of that, but it was still kind of hypothetical when we left. It was possible. But when we got back 4 days later, 5 days later, it was no longer a hypothetical. Things were shutting down. People weren't able to gather, and it was a deal. So that felt like overnight to me because I
Yeah.
left and the situation was tense, but like I said, hypothetical. And when I got back, it was like everything shut down.
My experience was very similar in that the company that I work for wanted us to we went they wanted us all to work from home on Friday. And so that they could test the network and make sure that it could sustain remote workers.
Right.
So everybody worked from home on Friday. Well, Monday morning we all get up and the news is stay home.
Mhm.
And we never went back, you know. And so then it was like, you know, months later that I had to exchange my laptop is what I had to do. And so they had me go in. And then they also wanted they were going to sanitize all the workstations. So we were supposed to pack up, you know, because my desk was just left. When I walked into the office they were, you know, you had to do all the temperature checks and all that stuff. You had to wear your mask, but it was like, and they only let in a limited number of people. I walked in and it was like a time capsule where, you know, we
Yeah.
had St. Patrick's Day stuff, decorations were out. And, you know, I was like, I was afraid to see what my water bottle would look like, you know, like, has the mold like taken over my entire cube. But it was just, and so eerie. I almost felt kind of like you know, Indiana Jones walking into a place that nobody has been for thousands of years. I mean, yeah, but it was several months. And So yeah, what a shock. And the thing is, this can happen at any.
And in connection with that, the first time that my Sunday school class met after that was on Zoom. It's one reason why I'm doing this interview with you today on Zoom is because I started recording my Sunday school classes and then I just haven't stopped. I don't do Zoom anymore except for these interviews. I usually just record what I do in class. But that was my very first lesson. We were starting the minor prophets, and we started with Joel, and we talked about Joel chapter 1, which is talking about disaster, a locust plague that hit Jerusalem. Just a few. I get the sense it was a few weeks or months before Joel wrote this down, but it was a recent historical disaster
Mhm.
in their town. And then in chapter 2, the wording starts talking about the day of the Lord. But my sense is that Joel was written with one main idea. The disaster we've just experienced is just a taste of what God's ultimate judgment is going to be like. So if you want to escape that disaster, there's only one way to do that, and that's by being loyal to Yahweh, to following his law and his rules and worshiping him. And I also see a lot of anticipation of the Messiah in Joel, in Christ. And of course, that is our Christian hope. There is only one way to escape the day of the Lord, and that is through faith in Christ and relationship with him. But that's what I would say. It felt that study in Joel felt so palpably appropriate for the situation we were in with COVID. And I would say it is true. As bad as COVID was, and as bad as the shutdown of Manhattan and of all of this economic activity, as bad as it looks like Revelation 18, that was just a taste of what God's ultimate judgment and wrath would be like. And like the book of Revelation, the point is you need to escape this because it's coming. You may think it's been bad the way you've encountered economic trials before. That's going to be worse. And you need to stay loyal to Christ because that is the only way through. Like to the Laodiceans, if you buy into the current economic system as your security, you're really poor and pitiable because there
Yes,
is no real security in the economic system of this world.
right. And I think that's the strongest lesson that we can take is that to rely on our comforts. And I mean, the United States is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And even if we're just middle class, we're still far richer than most people on the planet. And so we have to, and when I read this and reflect on this, I'm like, how often am I actually caving and giving into the world and the riches and the glamour and all of that? I mean, I think of my 401k and it's like, oh, all of these things. And it's like to be self-reliant is both a good thing and a bad thing, because we really need to be dependent on God and God's provision, and God will provide. But it's not necessarily going to be at the level that we have grown accustomed to,
Right.
because it's his plan is not just for these few moments in this world, in this life. It's what's beyond the end, the day of the Lord. That's where his goal and his aim is. And as strong as we can, we need to grab hold of him and grab hold onto his economy. And yes, we have to live in this world and we need to be good citizens and do what we can to love and help each other. But don't rely on the material goods of this world because they're all vapor.
Bottom line. All right. I want to thank all of you for joining me today and Cindy as we look at the book of Revelation through the lens of merchant trades and economics. If you'd like to continue the discussion, please add a comment under the YouTube video or join us at Facebook at the Storm of Scripture discussion group. Next week, we will resume our walk through the Revelation verse by verse. But until we meet again, be well, and then we will meet to examine the treasures in the biblical text.